I'm here with Seán Clerkin, who's retiring from the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, would be probably the best known person within the sector over many decades. And we're in our headquarters here in Monaghan, but due to COVID restrictions, we're in separate offices. And it's by way of a conversation with a life in rural water. And I suppose I want to go back, Seán, initially. I know that it's 40 years since your own group water scheme was established in Tadavnet here in North Monaghan. Can you tell me the circumstances around the establishment of that group water scheme and why you became involved in those efforts?
Yes, Brian, you're very welcome to the webinar here, and obviously we've had a great couple of days. And you and I are finishing off with a discussion around the origins or whatever. In a nutshell, Brian, our scheme, like many others, the main driver was the IFA, and the farmers, following accession to the EEC, they wanted water in the cattle houses. And so the committee met first in 1977, but they were looking at harnessing a lake up on the mountain and building a dam. But that became very expensive based on the grants available at the time. And then the consultants were talking about groundwater. And so I was invited onto the committee in 1981. In March, this is years ago, Brian, and I've been trying to get out ever since, and here we am 40 years later talking to you still about the project. So we drilled into an aquifer, Brian, so the consultants had recommended that, and we drilled our first well about May or June in 1981. And then we had to go to the department. At the time, there was no local authority involvement to look for grants, and they had to take a long view as to whether there was value in the underground source or not. So that was established probably later on in 81. And we put down our first production well, I think, at the end of 1981. And we've since drilled, I'd say, 6-7 wells since then. So that's my involvement. That's where we started, Brian.
Yours actually was one of the first schemes, I think, in the country to install universal metering. Can you tell me why you did that there and what were the benefits of it at the time? Do you have regrets around that?
Well, certainly no regrets, Brian. Myself and the late chairman, the late Nicholas Sherlock, who was chairman of the scheme for 25 or 6 years, we had the advantage of starting that wee bit later because the other schemes in Monaghan kicked off mid-70s. So what we did was a very practical thing. We visited the other schemes and asked them what was their experiences, what was their, what would they recommend, what were the pluses and what was the minuses. And we visited a little scheme out in your own area, Brian, outside close place called Scott's House. And they were getting water in from Northern Ireland. There was a large meter on the board. They were buying from Manor County Council. But the late Eugene Moore, who was the chairman or organizer of the scheme, advised us to put on meters because he said they had to do it because they had to pay back Northern Ireland based on the usage. But he said you won't be able to control unaccounted for water. The other schemes in Monaghan were using flat rate charging, so much an acre, so much a house. But they were drawn from lakes, but we knew from the word go that there would be some pressure on the aquifer, that it wasn't an infinite source. And so we put on meters from day one, Brian, as the best decision we ever made. We're totally believing in that, or believed at the time, totally vindicated. We've no doubt about that. Yeah.
Speaking of the aquifer, I think there was some controversy a few years after you were established when Monaghan County Council, actually the county manager at the time, thought that they might tap into the same aquifer and draw an ocean of water to supply Monaghan town. So that must have been a time of great nervousness within the scheme, or how did you handle that?
Yeah, well, 1986 we officially opened the scheme, and we had the minister at the time, his name escapes me at the moment. 2 or 3 years later, Brian, consultants for the county council, there were major hydrological, geological consultants, approached us because they felt that we had tapped into a unique sort of aquifer and source up in Knockdown. So we were fully open to that. We gave them our files and all the data we had from the GSI and from our consultants, because they believed there could be a large volume of water could be abstracted from that aquifer to serve Monaghan town. Monaghan town was suffering severe shortages, the droughts of '84. Certainly a thing comes to mind. And so we fully cooperated with that. In the meantime, we had put down a number of wells. We had drawn the water table down below the foot valve of some of the earlier wells. So I was a little bit concerned, but the then county engineer gave us permission to use a well that they had drilled in the meantime. And we also drew that down below the level. So suddenly then it looked like the aquifer may not have had the potential that was originally believed. But in the meantime, the county council had gone ahead and bought 10 or 12 acres of land out there. They were going to build a large reservoirs and a caretaker's house and so on. And then the alarm bells went off because we were suffering stress from our wells. So we approached the department. Obviously, the press got interested in the story, and it featured one evening on the 6-1 News, the RTE 6-1 News, because the county manager at the time, God be good to him now, he believed they were at the epicenter where we were, rather, and that they wanted to take that well off us and not they would supply us. And I recall them saying everything west of a certain bridge, and that had the connotations. I remember afterwards saying, almost like Cromwell, you can go west, my friend, and they would take everything to the east. So there was a whole publicity around that. The members resisted it, and I'll just throw this bit in. The turning point was, it wasn't for turning. The councillors had passed a special resolution at a specially convened local authority meeting. It went up to the department. The manager said no, he wouldn't give us the okay to draw down a grant of about $250,000 at the time we had spent. So he wouldn't give us the green light so the department could release that grant. And so it eventually, Lawrence McKenna, who is now our treasurer, stood up on his feet at a large meeting, nearly 500 people with the media present, said, right, let's do away with the grant, let's forfeit the grant, and we'll collect an extra £200 at the time per house in order to defray the costs that we'd already incurred. And the following day, the manager was on to us, and eventually we got that sorted. But yeah, it was scary times, Brian, in those early years, yeah. Yeah,
well, it obviously prepared you maybe for the controversy a decade later, I suppose, when you had the decision at department level to remove water charges in urban areas, and I think that began a major mobilisation within the group water scheme sector. Could you explain the background maybe to what happened in that period?
Well, there's one date, Brian, sticks out in my mind, the 19th of December, 1986, and you might say, well, what does that got to do with it? That was the day the minister, 5 days before Christmas, the then minister in the Rainbow government, Brendan Howland, TD, was Minister of Environment, announced the abolition of domestic charges in urban areas. Of course, he never thought of the group scheme. And look, if we were politicians, we made understand how that happened as well. There'd been a by-election in Dublin West in November that year, and Labour went into that with a 20% majority from the previous general election. That dropped to 2%. And Joe Higgins, I'm sure everybody remembers Joe Higgins. We often say we should nearly build a statue to Joe sometimes, because he came within a whisker of winning that by-election on the water issue, water charges issue. So the government of the day, led by Brendan Howland, was the minister. They had plans to actually introduce metering, Brian, would you believe it, in 1996. But the by-election threw everything on its head, and suddenly the bin, that was thrown in the bin, the report to go forward with metering. And so you're right, Brian, we had to sort of galvanise and travel the countryside to garner support and find out what the group schemes were, because the local authorities didn't know how many group schemes they had. We certainly didn't know much more than our neighbours. So Jerry Cowley, Bernard Keeley and George Defuich, to name but a few, and Paddy Ward himself travelled the country late at night, doing the day job during the day in identifying schemes, turning up at meetings. And I suppose the Federation was founded at Knock, Brian, in early 1987 in response to the decision of the Minister to abolish water charges. And we were looking for 2 or 3 very simple demands we had at the time. One was equity and fairness, because we couldn't collect water charges in the group schemes if there's free water in the towns and villages. Secondly, we wanted recognition as the representative body for the group scheme sector. That was granted, funnily enough, fairly quickly. And the third, which was a bit audacious maybe of us, we wanted the minister to reverse his decision on devolution, because part of the abolition of water charges, he devolved the whole administration and grants and so on for rural water down to the local authorities. And of course, we ourselves in Davenant had an experience that wasn't a sort of, as we talked about earlier, wouldn't sort of draw you to the conclusion that this was the ideal word to go to. And so then subsequently there was a general election in 1997. The rural water was negotiated during this time with Minister Dempsey, who had undertaken to do a whole study of the rural water with a view to establishing some sort of a long-term footing for the sector.
You started very much then, it appears, as a campaigning organisation, the Federation itself, that's clear from the history. But you moved very quickly from that kind of a campaigning approach to the partnership approach that has really been, I suppose, a hallmark of the success of the sector ever since then. Can you tell us how that came? Who made the approach to whom, and how did that come about?
Yeah, well, I mentioned there the general election of 1987, Brian. So obviously, in any campaign organisation or group will come together, they lobby the politicians. They were being to government. We need to meet Minister Brendan Howland. So we approached all the opposition. The main opposition parties at the time was Fianna Fáil and the PDs. And of course, the opposition will promise you whatever you want, more or less. They don't send you up with with a sad story or whatever. But we decided that we had to pin it down, particularly the man who later became the minister, who was the spokesperson, Noel Dempsey. So we drafted a series of demands, if you like, Brian, and we asked him to sign that so that we would have something afterwards. But here's the key, Brian, maybe. We had threatened to run candidates in that election. Now, there was a campaign at the time, the older generation like myself might remember this, the TV deflector. And they were also campaigning for better services in the west of Ireland, Donegal. They actually got a gay elected. I think the TD was Kildare, if I remember correctly. So we had threatened right up to the last minute. And then the opposition, including government, came racing back. Oh, come on in, we will talk to you, and so on. So we eventually made a decision, Brian, that we wouldn't run candidates. Subsequent to the election, then there was a series of meetings with the department and senior officials of the minister, and that's where the rural water programme was negotiated then, Brian, including the offer by the department that if we were prepared to come forward and work with them, they might look at the possibility of giving us some funding so that we could employ people in order to go out and do the developmental programme that we see today and that Barry and his team is exceptionally good at today. So I suppose that's the background, Brian, as to where the rural water programme came from, yeah.
Yeah, and the rural water programme, obviously a key feature of the rural water programme, a key demand was equity and fairness in relation to funding. And yeah, you had success in negotiating a level of funding support for the sector that hadn't been there up until that point, all right?
Yeah, that's very true, Ben. The first subsidy was granted about April by the Rainbow government, let's be fair, led by John Bruton. They did give a subsidy, but our problem was that we didn't have enough data on our side of the table to show what the expenditure was, because most of it, a lot of it anyway, certainly would have been voluntary. So remember the early stages on trying to put something on paper to justify what was happening and come up with figures. And Jim Ganley in the department, Terry Allen knows, I mean, the subsidy would have been quite small because we weren't able to quantify it, Brian. And the schemes were, in those early days too, they were very secretive almost. They kept their own sort of information. They didn't want to part with any knowledge to how they were operating and how they were doing. So there was a dearth of data, and we eventually did get a subsidy agreed, and it was announced in April prior to the general election. But subsequent, one of our other demands was the grants, Brian. The capital grants were totally inadequate to meet some of the works that were planned. And maybe another thing, indeed, the Assistant Secretary at the time, John O'Connor, because my background is civil service, and he called me down one day to the department and he confided in me the job of work that was probably going to face Ireland over the next few years, because the quality in the group schemes was way inferior to what was on the then public schemes. And I think the likes of John O'Connor and people in the department realised there was a major job of work to be done, and so they couldn't do it on their own. The local authorities didn't know who we were because there was only recently devolved to them. So they needed our cooperation and goodwill, which we sat down, and that's where the partnership, Brian, which we often talk about, it was an integral part of that rural water programme, which was formally launched, as you know, at the opening of the Snowden scheme in February 1998. So about 5 months, Brian, we negotiated the rural water programme, which included increased grants, increased subsidies again, but more importantly, support for the education, which is close to your own heart, Brian, to get the message out and to help people to understand what the real issues were, what the challenges were, and so on. So early beginnings, but exciting work, Brian, at the time.
Coming back to the meeting with John O'Connor and the approach, if you like, the almost collaborative approach that the department wanted to pursue, do you think that that was primarily motivated by the case being taken to the International Court of Justice by a member of Ballycroy Group Water Scheme? That case, I believe, went to the European Court in 1995. So yes. Do you think that was that a big factor, do you think, in driving the whole process from the department's perspective?
I've no doubt, Brian, as I said, they hinted earlier that John O'Connor was able to confide with me on some of the issues. So yes, he would have hinted at this issue, that there was a major train coming down the track and it wasn't going to be looking good from Ireland's point of view, and they would have to rectify this, but they were at a loss to know how they would do it. And indeed, maybe a little side story for you, Brian, the local authority people were also looking at it, and they had eventually produced a report which ultimately said the only answer to this was build major regional schemes across Ireland and connect every group scheme up to them. But I think senior people in the department realised this would take years and years to bring into reality. So I think that report got sidelined as well, and we sat down to look at schemes and see where they were and how we might do it. We went on a trip then to Brittany. Some people said it was a junket, but I mean, there was a lot of learning in that, Brian. And the great Louis Kilmartin, who was the former principal advisor to the department, Terry Allen, Jim Ganley, and a number of us went out there to look at how they were doing things in France. And the first thing that I noticed, Brian, when we got out of the bus to look at some of the sites, was the source protection measures that had been in place. They had the wells fenced around, had planted various shrubs and trees that were picking up nutrients. I didn't fully understand that on the day, Brian, to be honest with you, only subsequently that we realised it. But on the way back, they were looking at this, and we went out to look at the design, build and operate principle, the DBO for short, that we all know today. And that's where the origins of that particular thing, but it was directly in response to what you've said, Brian. The case was bubbling away in Europe. It looked like they weren't going to be able to stave off the Commission, because they're very determined that they were going to make an example of some member state. And to be honest, Brian, our group schemes were in pretty poor state. We were Cinderella at the ball. And we discovered subsequently that they were even worse than we imagined, because under the National Rural Water Monitoring Committee guidance chaired by Tom Collins, we did a major study in Roscommon of 36 schemes or whatever it was in Roscommon at the time. And we discovered that it was in the high 50s, if not even into the 60s, Brian. And people weren't alarmed that the water wasn't good, because they never intended most of these to be drinking water sources. I said earlier, driven by the farming community, they all had kept their own wells. So they weren't unusually alarmed. You'd imagine there'd have been an outcry at a march in Dublin with all the pure waters and group schemes. They weren't. They were happy enough that this was used out in the yard or whatever. But Europe wasn't satisfied with that. And so you're right, Brian, the department would have that had been uppermost in their mind, how they were going to deal with these potential fines. We lost that case, as you know, in 1981 or 2001, I think, from memory. The case was heard.
November 2002, actually, the judgment was released. But prior to that, I know that when I started with the Federation, the National Rural Water Monitoring Committee seemed to be driving a lot of the initiatives, and there seemed to be, in the early years, a focus very much on pilot studies, pilot technologies for water treatment and that there. So are you saying that the trip to Brittany really informed a major change in terms of how the problems were going to be approached?
Absolutely, Brian. There's no question doubt about it. I recall one day I was sitting on the National Rural Water Monitoring Committee representing the Federation, and I'd assumed in my innocence, Brian, that there was a budget and that there was some research ongoing all the time in perfecting water treatment facilities and so on. So I asked the innocent question, could we get a few bob out of this fund to start a few pilots in the area? And I think there was a moment of silence, that, you know, that embarrassing silent moment. Everybody looked at each other around the table, and the department had to acknowledge there wasn't any such fund. The local authorities were regarded as the experts in that, and had been done. So you're right, that was a very eye-opening trip to Brittany, Brian. We learned an awful lot about basic approach to water, but their emphasis at the time even was on source protection, which we are now catching up with many years later, as you know. But Dr. Tom Collins always believed that we shouldn't be depending on what he called end-of-pipe solutions. Building treatment plants, which is grand, and you need it there. It's a necessary part of your toolbox. But his whole approach was try and get into the catchment and see what you can do up there. But the trip to Germany, to France, Brian, we later went to Germany to look at some of the technologies that were used there. And they were all extremely invaluable in educating ourselves and trying to get our heads around some of the issues that we would have to grapple with. And so it took on a whole life of its own, Brian. Initially, we thought, get a few bob for the subsidy, leave the group schemes alone, and we continue on as we were. Little did we know what was ahead of us. It was just incredible.
Yes, it's important to remember, I suppose, that the vast majority of group water schemes at that stage were failing to meet the basic microbiological standards for water quality. And it seems like a lifetime ago now, but the transformation has been quite incredible. And again, that was largely driven, I suppose, by the Rural Water Monitoring Committee and that partnership approach again. But the Federation clearly played the central role in all of that.
Yes, I would say that, Brian. Maybe at this juncture we should pay great tribute to the group schemes themselves on the ground. You know, the organisers and the committees. We would meet them late at night. They were bringing some of this stuff to their attention, and they were happy to say to us, "Well, we're happy enough with what's happening down there at the lake or at the well. Why unite us?" And as you know, the major rationalisation and amalgamation programme in particular, we wouldn't have been able to do the DBOs without that, because on the way back from France on that first trip, I remember the department saying to us, "Could we get some?" And he looked at me, particularly in Monaghan, because they were aware that we had a small number of very large schemes in Monaghan, 7,000 or 8,000 households on about a dozen schemes. Whereas you go over to the Mayos and the Galways, they had 300 or 400 group schemes, you know, scattered all around the place. So if we get the quantum big enough that they could go to the market, as Louis said, and test the market, would there be a response? Would some of these international companies come in and give us decent prices to put in treatment? So the amalgamation process, Brian, was huge. Looking back on it, you know, out at night and encourage people to give up their independence and join the neighbouring scheme, where maybe the neighbouring parish had been fighting other in football for years and various other issues, but ask them to come in and share their resources and share the treatment. That was a mammoth task, but I have to give full marks and full credit to those schemes that came forward. Some were later than others, Doubting Thomas's, as you know, and some, unfortunately, few number didn't come forward. But those early schemes that came forward and were willing to listen to the Federation, willing to listen to our exhortations, and the department people, particularly I should mention Jim Ganley, who came out with us to several meetings at night to hear it firsthand. the issues that people had on the ground in terms of either what they had or what we were proposing for them. And that was absolutely vital to get the success of that. So I think it's something like, Brian, you might remember the statistic, was it 160 odd group schemes amalgamated down to 30 something. It was an incredible statistic, maybe much less than that, but it certainly was huge. Take in Roscommon, for example, there were 10 or 12 group schemes independent of each other, and we eventually married them and amalgamated them into one scheme. And I mean, that's just unbelievable in this day and age that you could achieve that. But the schemes themselves deserve the credit, Brian. We were a thorn in their side, I'm sure, and they had to take us on thrust. But there was very late nights with our development officers to the small hours of the morning. And but looking back on it, there's some satisfaction having achieved that, without a doubt. Yeah.
Yes, and it was the fact that there was a 20-year contract was proposed. Did that come from the group order scheme side, or where did that come from? And did that make schemes, do you think, more receptive to the whole idea of taking in a treatment plant operator? Do you how important was that factor, the longevity of the contract? Because now we're coming obviously to the end of the very first contract.
Well, there's two things, Brian. I suppose once we look for the bigger quantum, we were talking about the larger companies, the international companies, that met huge resistance on the ground, because smaller Irish companies had been working in the field, you know, and doing some chlorination or whatever. So they weren't going to be able to compete because they had a large track record in terms of finance and so on, and experience. So that was a major hurdle to hop across first, because I remember distinctly people tackling us and saying, so you want us to join this and buy back our own water from a foreign company? And I mean, at 10 o'clock at night in the country hall, you can see how that guy would get support. So that was an issue as well. I suppose the other thing then was that the treatment that was being proposed and that we had seen in local authorities were basically large, as some of our people said, large chemical plants. And so there was a fear of chemical treatment. And that was another hurdle we had to jump over, because our first pilot project in Glasgow was what's called a chemless. And in our innocence, we thought we had discovered something extraordinary that would be beneficial. And it ran for a number of years, but effectively, Brian, was the carbon was doing the work. And eventually that plant had to be pulled out. But it was a pilot project. And there's a large DAF, dissolved air filtration plant in there now, a chemical plant. So these were obstacles that country people had to get their heads around. Chlorination even, some schemes weren't using chlorine. They said, look, we were afraid of carcinogenic cancers and all sorts of scares were being pulled in, people going on the internet even then. So they were hurdles that had to be, and people that had to be assured of that. But I should say maybe quickly here that there was no DBO in Ireland up to then. The only thing was the wastewater rings end treatment plant, but it was a DB. We were fortunate in having somebody like Maurice O'Connell, who was the deputy city engineer, as recommended to us by the department. He had taken early retirement, health grounds, whatever. And he was the main brain behind the Rings End DB phase, the treatment plant at the time. So we brought him round with us to the country halls and said, look, while we may not be the engineers or the scientists, here's a guy who has done it, who understands design, build, operate, and to assure people that, and you're right about the 20 years, Brian, the 20 years was actually introduced by the department, not us. In fact, that was a big barrier for a long time. People say, you're going to close me out for 20 years, I can't even get back into my own treatment plan. But it was the best decision we made, Brian, because there was security and all of that. There was the prices were fixed, subject only to inflation, so they couldn't come back in a couple of years and say, "Oh, we left out such and such a thing, or we forgot to mention that." So the contracts were quite tight. The O&M, the operational maintenance contract. So 20 years, Brian, proved to be a huge success, and we were delighted with this. And indeed, in the future, we will be saying we should be 20 years or as close to. This makes no difference into the future again. Contractors, if they're doing more short term, and they've said that to us in recent times. If they're only doing a 4 or 5 year contract, well, they'd put in a small treatment plant or typical sort of thing off the shelf or whatever. It would last the 4 or 5 years, but after that, you could dump it because it would no longer be used. Whereas they had been in 20 years, they had to put better material, better technology, and so on, so as to ensure a longer lifespan. So, but it was the department introduced the 20 years, Brian. Not we hadn't a clue what duration we were going to look for, but they pushed hard on the 20 years, and we agreed that.
Yes, coming back to Tom Collins, you mentioned, and the source protection kind of focus. I always remember at the first conference I went to in 2002, one of the audience said, when the focus was, of course, on treatment, because they needed to make the water safe, obviously microbiologically safe, but one of the speakers up from the floor said, are we putting the cart before the horse? Would you agree that that was a good interpretation of what we did, because we had to do it? Where do you see source protection now in the future of the group water scheme sector?
Well, without a shadow of a doubt, Brian, we had the cart before the horse, but we had no cart or horse at all coming into the field. So we literally had to take what was there in order. And in fairness, I mean, the department gave us, the Commission gave us a certain number of years to deal with this. But in fairness to the Commission, I'm sure due to the brilliance of the civil service in environment, this got a number of years to help us to achieve what we did achieve at the end. To get that compliance rate was as low as 47%. You mentioned earlier the microbiological. It was as low as 40%, and I think Roscommon even said much higher than that. So we're up into 96s and 87s in recent years, and we'd love it to be 100% quite naturally, and everybody worked for that. But source protection will be the key, Brian. And I think I recall Tom Collins pushing this in the Church of Loram area in County Monaghan many years ago, and as a pilot project. And it worked very, very well, and learning in every pilot. But I remember the fencing that went in, Brian, along the riverbanks and so on, and tried to ensure that there wasn't slurry spread and whatever. But because it lost focus and the steering group stood down after a number of years, some of the farmers, and this is a true story, some of the farmers eventually lifted the fencing that was going along the river and ran it perpendicular to the river for strip grazing purposes. So the end result was that there was no fine, not in all cases, I should say, but source protection, without a shadow of doubt, Brian, is going to be the success or otherwise of all water service in the future, because we know of climate change, we have a huge loss in biodiversity, and I think a lot of farmers genuinely don't fully understand pulling out hedges and so on that would otherwise act as a barrier. So I think the focus at the moment on that, and some great work being done by the Federation, particularly you mentioned earlier, the Roscommon and the Monaghan pilot project, and that has to be the way forward, because if you depend on end pipe solution, the thing in the catchment is going to get worse, Brian. The condition, climate change is going to impact greatly on that. So far from taking it for granted the treatment plant will do it, we have to almost assume that it's not going to do it and go into the catchment and harness the goodwill that's in there. All of the people, we make the point that many of our group scheme people own the land in there in the catchment. So it'd be much easier if you were coming to me today to say, look, Seán, we're having difficult, and I'm a farmer and I'm not fully aware. But if you explain to me that ultimately the water that we're using, that my family is using, is coming from a source that I'm impacting on as a farmer, I'm much more likely to listen, Brian, to you making that case to me than if you're some faraway state body coming to me, be it Irish Water or whatever else, because I say, well, that's your problem, you solve it, I still have my job. I think the ownership of the group scheme sector, the fact that they own it, every member has a share in it, they own it collectively, and it's up to themselves then to come together and do it. And some great work being done on that at the moment. So key for the future, Brian, without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, you must be very happy that the Department of Agriculture is now come on board along with the Department of Environment to support Federation efforts in this area.
Yeah. Clearly, yes, Brian, delighted. I remember a couple of years ago when Barry Dean and I walked into Johnstown Castle to meet agricultural officials on this very issue to see could we get some funding. And I think they looked at us across the table as if we were some alien guys, right? What had it got to do with them almost? So we're trying to explain, and recent times, fair play to Barry, he's kept up that continuous communication, he and his management team, and we now have the success of that, Brian, bearing fruit, that the $500,000 or whatever it is over a couple of years being granted there very, very recently, and signed off quickly by the Minister, Charlie McConlogue TD, who announced it literally within weeks of the formal request going in. So I think that says a lot about the Federation, what they're doing. The Department of Agriculture is looking around to see can we assist, and they saw the logic, Brian, quickly, that we had the key, we had the latch into the area, into the catchment where many of the farming community live and reside, obviously. So you're right, Brian, it's very exciting times that another department alongside the Department of Environment or the Department of Housing and Heritage is going to fund this, because ultimately you have to, prevention is much better than cure. What's the old adage? Stitch in time saves 9. Well, I think in this case, it's very well spent. And I think, recall, Brian, I think you and I might have been at a conference on one occasion. We both noted this comment or this quote. I think it was in the UK, you correct me here, where they said if for every pound spent in the catchment in terms of source protection, we'll save up to £60 at the treatment plant. Is that incredible?
Indeed, that's in relation to herbicide prevention, herbicide contamination prevention in the south of England. And it is a hugely important area, obviously, for our own sector, because the treatment plants in Ireland generally don't have comprehensive treatment to deal with the issue of herbicides. So it has to be dealt with at catchment level. You're correct. Seán, you clearly have a great interest in the declaration, if you like, of a climate and biodiversity emergency by the Houses of the Oireachtas a few years ago has clearly impacted on the approach of the Federation. And I understand that in your retirement, you're planning, along with your group, as part of your group water scheme, to set up a facility specifically to address that issue, an educational facility. In fact, I have, maybe you can see it, this is to Davenant Group Water Scheme. It's a newsletter, and this is an old school the scheme has purchased and is going to develop along with the grounds, 2 acres ground. Can you tell us about this project?
Yeah, basically, Brian, we're calling it an environmental education centre. And this goes back a number of years, Brian. We were looking at a school closer to our own headworks back maybe 10, 12 years ago. But because it was part of a lease dating back to the 1880s, when the national school closed sometime in the end of the 90s, but there was no registration, no ownership of it, and it was taking years and years and years to do. And it eventually literally ran aground a year ago or 18 months ago now. So we looked around it because we had been looking at and doing some research on the potential for education. I know this is very close to your heart, Brian, because in the Federation, I think you brought the educational thing to the table in terms of education and booklets you prepared for schools, both national and secondary schools. So we had sort of understood that from early years that the best solution is if the kids get the message, they'll annoy the hell out of mommy and daddy to try to do it. So this particular school that we purchased now closed about 8 or 9 years ago. And between stamp duty and purchase price, something in the region of over 200,000, Brian. And I have to give credit to my board here, the chairman and the full board members, who had faith and confidence to invest that kind of money. We get no grant towards that, but we're going to develop it now into, there's about 1 acre, 2 acres nearly around the school, into a biodiversity hub, we're calling it. So the school kids, and same to school kids, and already we have 8 or 9 schools in contact from the initial publicity that went out about it, who wish to come to see it. And unfortunately, it's not ready yet, Brian. It'll probably be 12 months before we do it, because major reconstruction at the school itself. But the garden is as we speak being developed. And the idea will be that schools will visit there. We'll take them through maybe the exhibition area, or let them see the interactive video stuff all about climate change. It's the 3 main areas we're focused on, Brian. Clearly is water, obviously. Climate change and biodiversity, and their national emergencies, as you've just said. And then, having gone through the school, as we know, of the centre, we will then bring them out to see the reality of it in the field itself, and listen and hear questions and so on. It's an exciting project, Brian, and we're getting LEADER funding. I should thank LEADER for this as part of the development of it and the reconstruction and so on. So we had hoped to have it finished in about 12 months. And yes, that's the reason, Brian, that I'm going retirement. If I hadn't had something like that, the wee wife probably wouldn't even let me retire now, because she doesn't want me around her feet. So this issue, or this project that we've undertaken, is probably going to take 7.5 days a week, Brian, if I can get the other half day. To add to what I'm doing. So clearly, the Federation, I need to take a breather. Anyway, and you can see me bald head, Brian. I think I probably should have gone. When you hit 70, Brian, and a little bit longer, I think it's time to get out and leave it to the younger people. And I think Barry, Jean and Joe as the management team, they do a tremendous job. But yes, we're excited by the Knockton Grave project, Brian. It's an educational centre, we're calling it. And I want to thank your good self as a research and information officer, Brian, because you did help me with the defining the process to go to the department, because the Department of Education had a hold on this particular school, Brian, for another 40 years, would you believe it? So if they parish, it was Clogher Diocese, had they sold it on the open market to a commercial person, whatever, or even a private household, they might have had to pay 40 or 50,000 back to the department in grants that were, because they did a major extension in the early 2000s. But because we're using it for education purposes, and because the good case we made, Brian, which you helped me put together, and I was in and out of the offices in Tullamore, they accepted what we were doing as exciting. So the fee to be paid back was a mere 2,000 odd that the parish had to pay it back. So we're excited by all of that. So look, at whatever few bits ahead.
Not only exciting, but also educational, and it's fulfilling the remit for which the building was constructed in the first instance. But I think we'll have to leave it there, Seán. But obviously, you're going to be a big miss from the Federation. Maybe it's a major project you have ahead of yourself. It's great to see that you're not hanging up your boots entirely. And I think that on behalf of the staff, I'm sure the board and all of the group water schemes around the country, wish you the very, very best. Brian, agus slán agus banna.